Welcome to All Pro Football Data. My name is Jim Coburn, and today's episode we're talking about the Atlanta Falcons 2024 NFL Draft Class Review based on data. We're going to be looking at production, athleticism, and other statistical factors to see how well the Atlanta Falcons did in this draft. Stay tuned until the end of the video where I give my final grade on the Falcons draft. But this is going to be a comprehensive draft grade. It's going to look at all of their statistical data. It's going to look at every nook and cranny you could think of to see whether or not this was a good draft or a bad draft for the Falcons. Now, what do I grade the draft on? One area is called draft approximate value or draft pick approximate value. What that is each range of picks typically has an average approximate value score long term. So in other words, if you pick a player at pick 8 or pick 10, they typically have an average. If you take all those prospects that were taken at pick 10 and you get their overall AV for their career and you divide it and get a mean for that number, that's what it is. So it's essentially what's expected of that draft pick in that pick range is what that is. Now, when you get to draft pick approximate value pick range, this can kind of give you an idea of what that means in terms of picks 1 through 5, all the way down to picks in the 250 to 60 range. To kind of give you an idea of the lower you go, the more likely you're probably not going to be a great NFL player, and then the higher you go, the more likely you are going to be a decent player wherever you're drafted at. Now, in terms of the other grading I do a EAV or expected approximate value grade. So this is what, based on their overall data grade, so taking a look at their production, their age, their athleticism traits, strength of schedule, strength of team, all those different factors, this number takes all of their data and boils it down into one number. And based on that number, it can tell you what is their expected approximate value based on how they tested across the board. So in many ways, it's like a ceiling grade. How much potential does this prospect have based on how he tested as a prospect with various statistical data? That's what this score is, and that definitely is also used in terms of the grading. Also, limiting factors is something to mention real quick, which is what are some of the things that can affect the data, affect the outcomes? Well, one of those things is the coaching of a team can affect the development or a lack of development of a prospect. Uh, Publicity of a media market can influence the perception. Unforeseen injuries can lead to inconsistent outcomes with the data. Another thing is psychological and mental makeup can affect NFL outcomes. Johnny Football, for example. Also, substitution bias, which allows for the possibility that coaches switch from a higher costing prospect to a lower cost but lower quality. This happens all the time. You'll have prospects that get drafted to replace great players, and they're not going to replace them. They're not going to. They're not going to be. It's like you're drafting a prospect to replace Jerry Rice. They're not going to be as good as Jerry Rice ever was, but they're going to be cheaper than Jerry Rice, and that's how some teams and coaches think is to get a lesser quality player. And because of that, players that probably shouldn't have started end up starting, end up getting value because of that, when they probably shouldn't have started to begin with. So those are some of the limiting factors in terms of the data. Atlanta's needs. So this is a chart of the Atlanta Falcons overall starting roster prior to the draft. It takes a look at their positional value in terms of AV, how they actually performed, not their data, but how they actually have performed. It also takes a look at their EAV or expected approximate value score coming out of college. It has their age and their efficiency scores. In terms of the Atlanta Falcons' needs this year, and again, before we get into the picks, we have to talk about their needs. Offense of needs. Quarterback was at basically one of the largest needs on offense. So as much as people want to hate on the selection of Michael Penix Jr., which will certainly have room to argue and debate it, believe me, they did need a quarterback. They needed somebody to come in maybe not right now, but in the future to take over Kirk Cousins, because Kirk Cousins is going to be 36 years old, and most quarterbacks, once they hit age 36 and above, have a significant decline in terms of their play, or they end up retiring. So not every quarterback is going to be Tom Brady in their 40s. That's not going to be the result. And even Tom Brady in his 40s was inconsistent as heck during that time period. So just remember that. So overall, they did have a need on quarterback. Tight end, they also had a need, mainly with somebody to pair with Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts is a great tight end, but they need another tight end to kind of pair with him to kind of improve that area. And then overall, the rest of their draft was great. Their running backs are decent. Their wide receivers are great. So all those areas are pretty much felt. And defensively, this is probably by far their biggest needs as a team is on defense. Their edge needs help. Defensive tackles need help. Linebackers, cornerback to a lesser extent, and safety a lesser extent. But all the needs that really need to be met are linebacker, defensive tackle, and edge. Those are the big things that they should have addressed in this draft class. Did they address it? Well, that's what these draft grades are going to be about. So first off, the biggest factors in terms of my final grade drafting or evaluating teams. Again, I'm a lot different than everybody else. I don't do knee-jerk reactions to the draft. I look at the data, I look at the facts, and I form my statements based on those facts. I don't just, I don't like that player, so I'm going to give him an F. That's not how I do things. I base it on the numbers. So, biggest factors in terms of how I grade. Did they meet their roster needs? That's number one. The biggest needs are quarterback, tight end, edge, defensive tackle, linebacker, and cornerback. And not only that they met their needs, did they draft good prospects? That's another factor. Did they draft good prospects? Because if you draft bad prospects, you're going to have to draft a quarterback, a tight end, an edge, a defensive tackle, a linebacker, and a quarterback in the next draft class, or at least get them in free agency. So that is something that you definitely have to factor in terms of draft grades. Also, did they draft prospects that have the data potential to outperform their draft status? This is probably different from everybody else, but I find that when teams draft prospects with great data grades, they run a higher chance of those prospects breaking out from where they're selected at. So if you go back to that chart that I showed you earlier on in the video, when you draft a prospect in the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th round, you're going to have a steep decline in terms of what is expected from those prospects long term. But if you draft prospects that have great data grades, they have a great shot of outperforming where they're drafted at compared to other prospects. So always draft prospects that have better data grades than where they're selected at. Otherwise, you're not going to be a very happy person. Now, are there going to be prospects that buck the trends? Absolutely. But your entire draft class can't be a bunch of outliers. Okay? You can't have an entire draft class just filled with outliers. Okay? So just keep that in mind. You're definitely going to have some players who are going to outperform my data and my metrics, but not all of them are. They can't all outperform it. So these are questions that data can give some answers to, and we'll start to answer those questions right now. Starting with pick 8, Michael Penix Jr., quarterback out of Washington. His overall data grade or ceiling was 60.27 out of 100. His floor grade, so the quarterbacks that tested like Michael Penix Jr. in the first round averaged a 77.73 out of 100 approximate value score. The balanced grade is taking his ceiling and his floor and averaging out those numbers to give you a balanced grade. So we're taking his ceiling based on data, and we're taking his floor based on data, and we're kind of merging them together to give what the most likely outcome is based on the information we have right now that could be a possibility for him. And based on that, Michael Penix is not that great of a prospect to be picked at 8. His pick AV is 96.91 out of 100. So most selections that are picked at pick 8 become 96th percentile prospects long term. But most prospects at his age with his data end up becoming 77 to 69 percentile prospect. That's a problem. It's a big, big, big problem. And that's why that pick would be a D plus. Okay. Now, taking a look at his mobile quarterback score. So these are some of the statistics to kind of look at here. This is Michael Penix Jr. as a mobile quarterback. Taking a look at his rushing market share, touchdowns per rush, yards per rush, all those factors. Penix Jr. was decent in terms of TD percentage, but the rest of his data was kind of average. So he does have great athleticism traits, but Michael Penix Jr. should not be viewed as a mobile quarterback or a quarterback that you're going to rush consistently, and nor should you based on the injuries that he had in his career. So he's more of a pocket passer, and as a pocket passer, so we're going to look at quarterback efficiency scores right now. He was decent. His best score was 91.75 out of 100, and his CQS or career passing efficiency score was 70.31 out of 100. But the biggest issue is his age, and I know a lot of people are tired of hearing about the age argument with Michael Penix Jr. They're tired of hearing about it, the COVID and his injuries and all that kind of stuff. He's a great player. It's just he had all these bad misfortunes in his career. I get all of those arguments, but even when you take away the age out of it, did he test like an all-pro player? No. His career passing efficiency was nowhere near an all-pro level player. When you look at the Pro Bowl averages, he wasn't near that area. It was about 5 points away from that area. When you go to the starter averages, wasn't near that area. And honestly, the closest prospect to him, based on his overall data, would be Chad Pennington. Based on his age and based on his passing efficiency data, would be Chad Pennington. That is the closest comparison for him at pick 8. So that's a concern. That's not a pick that you select there. And you saw the other needs. You saw the other needs that you saw them. So I understand that they took a quarterback. It's just they might have taken the wrong quarterback. Time will tell, obviously, but this was not the best pick based on data. Now we get to pick 35, where we get Rook or Horror. Data grade 72.37 out of 100. His floor grade is 57.58, and his balance grade is 64.97 out of 100. The AV of picks selected here is 89.58 out of 100, and his overall pick grade would be a D. Now, this might be one that I get a little bit of flack on, but the thing is, based on how he tested as a prospect, based on his data, all the prospects that tested like him in that round area were 57 percentile grading prospects. So I'm grading him better than what is expected for a prospect that tested like him in his area. So that's a concern. Now, why did he test so low? Well, first off, you have to look at defensive market share. So you can pause the video real quick to kind of look at that. But defensive market share wise, he had great sack market share, sack production, and above average TFL production, but below average solo tackle production. Most defensive tackles you want to have at least above average solo tackle production, and that definitely is a concern. He's more of a pass rusher than a great all-around defensive tackle prospect. Then, of course, you look at his other market share scores, his forced fumbles, pass deflections, and interceptions. Did well in terms of pass deflection data, not do so well in terms of interception data or forced fumble data. And as you can see with the starter averages, the Pro Bowl averages, and the All-Pro averages, they usually average above, in terms of forced fumbles, pass deflection, interceptions, usually in the 60 to 70 percentile in terms of those areas. Now, moving on to athleticism testing. This is the biggest misconception with him. A lot of people have put him as a elite level athlete when that's not the case. He had a 79 percentile explosion score, 81 percentile speed, and 75 percentile flexibility for his size. So he is an above average athlete. He's a near elite athlete, but he's not exactly a 90 plus percentile athlete, nor is he 85 percentile athlete overall. So he is a very good athlete, but he's not an elite athlete, which I think a lot of people have been touting him as, which I don't really see is the case with his overall data. Next up, we have adjusted production scores. Adjusted production takes a look at other factors such as, strength of team, strength of schedule, and age. Because a lot of guys are going to go, yeah, his production wasn't that great, but he played at Clemson. This adjusts for that. It adjusts for the fact that he played at Clemson. And when you take a look at his data right here, he definitely is closer to the starter averages than the Pro Bowl averages or All-Pro averages at the position. So, best case scenario, you have a starting defensive tackle, but overall, I just don't quite see it in terms of his overall data grade. So, it is potential for him to become a starter, but he's a fringe guy. And you picked him at pick 35. You picked a fringe starting defensive tackle at pick 35. That's not the best decision ever. Next up, we have Braylon Trice, edge out of Washington. His data grade is 52.90 out of 100. His floor is 53.72. His balanced grade is 53.51. And his AV for where he was selected is 70.66 out of 100. This is a F. So again, most prospects drafted where they drafted at pick 74 are 70 percentile AV prospects. Braylon Trice, based on his data grade, is 52.90. Based on the players who tested like him data-wise, his floor is 53.72. And then when you combine the two, his balance grade would be 53.51. That's not what you want to select at pick 74. And why is this? Well, let's look at his data. So first off, he had average solo tackle data, above average sack market share, above average TFL market share. But when you look at his other market share traits like forced fumbles and pass deflections, he was below average. And then, of course, you look at his athleticism traits, not that great. 12 percentile in terms of explosiveness, 45 percentile in terms of speed, and 62 percentile in terms of flexibility for his size. All those areas are not what you would expect from him there. Also, in terms of adjusted production scores, looking at his data here, starter averages, all-pro averages, Pro Bowl averages, is nowhere near those averages at the position of edge. So those are all a really big concern for him. I would be very, very, very surprised if Braylon Trice went on to become a long-term starting edge. The vast majority of starting edges typically are in the 60 and higher percentile. So for him not to be in that percentile for his overall data is not what you want to see out of a prospect like this, especially for how high he was drafted. Then, of course, we get to pick 109, which is Brandon Dorless, defensive tackle out of Oregon. His data grade is 55.96 out of 100. His projected floor grade is 54.63, and his balanced grade is 55.29. The average AV of the area they selected him at is 56.39. And the overall pick grade is an F. So they got a player pretty much is on par with what is expected at pick 109 versus a prospect that could outperform where they were selected. Taking a look at Brandon Dorless based on his overall data, he had 39 percentile solo tackle data, 44 percentile sack data, and 79 percentile in terms of tackles for loss. Decent tackle for loss data, but not quite there in terms of solo tackles and sacks. When you look at his other efficiency data, he did really good in terms of pass deflection market share, not so hot in terms of forced fumble market share. And when you look at his athleticism traits, he does have above average explosiveness and above average speed, but his flexibility is off in terms of 43 percentile. So he is an explosive, fast, stiff defensive tackle or interior defensive line prospect in many ways. And when you get to his adjusted production traits, doesn't quite hit all the areas that you're looking for there in terms of starter averages, Pro Bowl averages, and All-Pro averages in the position. So he is a concerning prospect from that kind of examination. Next up, we get to pick 143 with J.D. Bertrand, linebacker out of Notre Dame. Data grade would be 48.57 out of 100. His projected floor grade is 43.08 out of 100. His balance grade would be 45.82 out of 100. And his AV, or pick AV, would be 44.79 out of 100. This would be an F. I know there's a lot of fans of J.D. Bertrand out there, but his overall data is concerning. Taking a look at his overall linebacker market share, he had near elite solo tackle production, but he has average sack production and average or slightly above average TFL production. So he pretty much is not really near the averages at the position for starters in terms of his tackle and sack production, especially his tackle for loss production. When you look at his other efficiency traits, he has great pass deflection market share, but not so much in terms of forced fumble market share or interception market share at the position. And then when you look at his athleticism traits, he didn't have any testing to really judge him off of. His projected 40-yard dash would have put him at a 65.96 percentile speed score, but we don't know what his overall athleticism would be, so that kind of hurts his overall profile. But the biggest thing that really lowers him is his adjusted linebacker production profile. So his age, he had a 5.23 age score, 66.09 in terms of MSA, and 64.44 in terms of pass. That's nowhere near the Pro Bowl averages, starter averages, or All-Pro averages at the position, and that is not what you want to see out of a prospect like this long term. So I do know there's some fans of him. He does have some decent production here and there, but I would be concerned about this pick based on his overall data profile. Then, of course, we get to pick 186 with Jace McClellan, running back out of Alabama. His data grade is 80.59 out of 100. The floor grade is 41.73. And the balance grade I would put at 61.16 out of 100. The average AV of where he was selected is 40.15. But I would give this overall pick grade a D in terms of just a general grading of it. He has a potential to be much more productive than where he was drafted. I understand he's not going to the best position, with Bijan there, but overall, you have a decent player here. And when you look at his production, he didn't have the best market share data in terms of his total offensive market share, receiving market share, and touchdown market share, but he did have great efficiency scores, all in the 80-plus percentile in terms of touchdowns per touch, yards per reception, and yards per touch. All those areas were fantastic for him. Athleticism-wise, he did have an 84 percentile speed score in terms of his data, but didn't quite have the explosion testing or flexibility testing to determine those other areas. And when you look at his adjusted production traits, he was close to the starter averages. So Jace McClellan does have a lot of potential to become a long-term starter for the Atlanta Falcons, or at least a very decent backup to what they already have. So this was actually one of the better picks they had in terms of day 3. Then, of course, we get to Casey Washington, wide receiver out of Illinois. His data grade or ceiling is 42.10 out of 100. His projected floor grade is 25.23. His balanced grade is 33.66. And the pick AV is 27.41 out of 100. Overall pick grade would be an F for him. Taking a look at his production traits, below average in terms of market share production. Taking a look at his other efficiency traits, below average in terms of touchdowns per touch and yards per reception. But he does have above average athleticism. He had an 86 percentile explosion score, 71 percentile speed, with a 19 percentile flexibility score. So he does have above average explosiveness and speed for his size. But when you look at his adjusted production is nowhere near the starter averages, the Pro Bowl averages, and All-Pro averages. So again, this was just not a great pick because you already are picking in a round where you're more likely just going to get a backup or rotational reserve or practice squad player, and you're going to pick a player who's probably going to underperform that status based on his overall data. So this was not that best of it. This might be one of their worst picks, to be honest, for the Falcons. Next up, we get pick 197, Zion Logue, defensive tackle out of Georgia. In terms of his data grade or ceiling, he had a 39.21 out of 100. His projected floor grade is 29.54. His balance grade is 34.38. And his pick AV is 39 out of 100. Overall grade would be an F. Taking a look at his production traits, non-existent production, probably one of the least productive defensive tackles in this draft class. When you look at his other traits, though, good forced fumble market share, good pass deflection market share, with below average interception market share. Matter of fact, I don't think he really even had an interception, but overall, production was just way too inconsistent. Then when you look at his athleticism traits, he had above average explosiveness with below average speed and below average flexibility for his size. And then his adjusted production was below average when you look at the starter averages at the position in terms of his MSA rating, his age, and all those other sort of factors. So probably going to be a backup to reserve type, not a player that can really outperform his draft status in many ways based on data. Overall, the final grade that I would give the Atlanta Falcons would be an F minus. Did they meet their roster needs? I would say no. They drafted a lot of prospects to fill their needs in terms of guys like Michael Penix Jr. for the quarterback need long term. They obviously drafted some edge rushers, some defensive tackles to kind of fill those needs as well. But based on their overall data, based on their production traits, their athleticism traits, everything like that, these are prospects that are very risky prospects that have a very high chance of busting. And you're not going to have multiple prospects that have bad data scores to hit all at the same time. That's just, I'm a probability guy. That's extremely unlikely, if you will. So that's the concern here. Did they draft good prospects? I would say no. They didn't draft good prospects. They drafted prospects that, honestly, based on their overall data, they never should have been drafted to begin with. So I understand this. I understand I can be negative sometimes in terms of data evaluations, but they did draft a lot of prospects that really aren't good prospects. They're prospects that are more so backup reserve type players, and I just don't think you should draft those types of players in day 3 of the draft. Did they draft prospects that had the data potential to outperform their draft status? No. The vast majority, if not all of their draft picks, do not have the ability to outperform their draft status, with the exception of Jace McClellan, who was their late round running back at a position that is not of need right now. So that's a problem. Penix Jr. does have the potential to become a Chad Pennington-like starter, to kind of get some starts here and there, and to be Mr. Mediocre, if you will, long term. But the overall data for this class is just not where you want it to be. The same thing could be said of Rook, who has potential to become a starter or two, but most of these picks have very low data ceilings and low data floors. So that's a concern. So I'm not really going to speak too much on this, but overall, I would have to give this draft class an F minus. Probably the worst draft class this year. And we'll see in the future what it turns out to be. But most of the data work that I've done, 93% of the time when I say a team had a bottom 5 draft class, they usually either have a bottom 5 draft class or they have a bottom 24 and below draft class. So either way, there's only a 7% chance that this draft class is going to outperform expectations based on data. And that's not exactly where you want it to be. Overall, though, thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Jim Coburn. You can follow my other work at patreon.com/jcoburn. Consider becoming a subscriber there. It really helps out a lot. And I'm going to be having some team-based data on the Falcons pretty soon, within a week or so. So stay tuned for that on that area. Also check out my X, formerly known as Twitter account, at Geometrics. And like, comment, and subscribe. How do you guys feel about the Atlanta Falcons draft class overall? I was a little bit shocked at the Penix pick. I understand it from a data perspective, but I think they picked the wrong player. But let me know in the comment section below what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.